partnerships. I'd like to welcome Kirk Siegler from National Public Radio, who will be moderating this panel, and our 4 distinguished panelists. Welcome.
All right, hello. Thanks, guys. Let me grab my notes here real fast. While everyone's getting seated, I kind of walked in late to the last panel, but I detected a little bit of hunger for talking more about e-bikes. So let's spend the next hour and 15 minutes with various rants about that. Just kidding. Okay. We're going to have a similarly scheduled structure-wise panel as the last. So you all have lengthy bios in your pamphlets. My name's Kirk Siegler. Thanks for joining us here. I cover the Western U.S. for NPR. Most of our stories these days are about public lands, and have always been. A lot of our coverage in the past year, a year ago or so, was devoted to the flooding in Yellowstone National Park. So I think we'll start off with a brief introduction of Cam Sholly, sitting to my left. Each of our panelists will talk for about a few minutes about some introductory remarks. Then, based on what they say, we'll go to a few questions, and of course, questions from all of you. So Cameron Sholly, who is the Superintendent of Yellowstone National Park, will begin. You can grab one of these guys over here. I think.
Let's try. How's that?
That works. Yeah.
Good morning. How's everybody doing? It's good to see you. Great to see my good friend Steve Bullock. You'll hear from later today, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I love talking about recreation, conservation. Most of you, I'm sure, have visited Yellowstone at least once. I'm sure you are aware there's no shortage of opinions on what we should be doing or how we should be doing it. That's because people care. Yellowstone is really a gem. It's a global icon. The national park system in America is the greatest in the world. Lots of countries have worked to emulate our system. Yellowstone's commemorated its 150th anniversary last year. I think that's something for us to celebrate as Americans. I think it's something for us to reflect on as kind of the genesis. We're here talking about recreation. We look at the resources that people recreate in. It's important for us to visit how we got to where we are. I think there's a lot of lessons learned from the past century and a half that can be applied into the future. I think it's imperative that we pay attention to those lessons as we move forward. If you think about 100 years ago, we killed every single wolf in Yellowstone. We killed every predator for the most part. We wiped out the bison population from tens of thousands just in Yellowstone to less than 25 animals. 50 years ago, we were allowing visitors to look at grizzlies in garbage dumps. We allow them to feed grizzlies and black bears. And we've slowly put the pieces back together of the Yellowstone ecosystem and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem over the last 50 to 60 years, not in a large time span. And I think if you look at what people come to Yellowstone for, from a recreational standpoint, 1948 was the first year that Yellowstone had 1 million people in the park in a single year. 1965 was the first year we had 2 million in the park in a single year. 1992 was the first year we had 3 million. 2015, 4 million in a single year. 2021, we got to almost 4.9. So previously, we had the luxury of 15 to 20 years between each additional million, and that time frame is shrinking because more people are going to their public lands, including national parks, to enjoy themselves, to recreate. Steve and I, if you think 3 years ago, Steve and I were in the midst of a Yellowstone closure because of COVID. An incredible amount of work went into trying to navigate that. As we all know, we all did that across the country. But COVID changed a lot of the visitation patterns in Yellowstone. And in our surrounding, we have 5 national forests that surround Yellowstone. They saw a lot of different types of uses that came up because of COVID. And so we never know what's coming next. We can look at the past and try to gauge what we need to be doing in the future. But we also need to be flexible to be able to respond to the challenges that are coming our way and be adaptable and understand that everybody's got a different definition of what recreation is. I get a lot of, put a shuttle system in Yellowstone. Someone said the other day, you should put a monorail in Yellowstone. If I were to talk to each one of you about what your definition of recreation is and what you like about going to Yellowstone, I would get a large number of different answers. Some of you want to fish 4 different places on the Madison. Some of you want to go to Lamar Valley and watch wolves. Some of you want to watch birds. And you like the freedom of being able to choose where you go, what you look at, which trail you hike. Yellowstone's 2.2 million acres, 1,750 acres of roads, parking lots, and pullouts. Most of that park never sees a visitor. 98% of visitors never get more than a half mile away from their car. So we have a very large problem, and a very small percentage of the park is something that we have to take seriously. We spend probably 97% of our budget, time, and energy in less than 1% of the park overall. But there's an incredible opportunity there as well. And so I look forward to a conversation with you about how we can do better as public lands managers. I think we've done an incredible job of expanding the conversation, not only with our federal partners, building great relationships with states and tribal partners as well, and the press. And by the way, I'm assuming all this is off the record that we're going to talk about today.
You should know there's no off the record, right?
But the biggest thing is the support that we get. We have a lot of support. People love Yellowstone. People love the GYE. I was speaking in Bozeman with about 200 people, and I went up to a lot of them, or they came up to me and said, yeah, we just moved here from San Diego or New York or wherever. And then they proceeded to have a conversation about how to get people to stop moving to Bozeman. And so there's a lot of realities externally that we need to focus on with economic development and that crossover between recreation, wildlife conservation, protection of resources. That could be difficult, but it's a worthwhile conversation. And I appreciate being here myself, and I appreciate you being here and having this conversation. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Superintendent Sholly. Up next, we have Sammy Matsaw from the Fort Hall Shoshone Bannock tribes, who's a research scientist, also speaking with a pretty key perspective here about tribal perspectives on public lands recreation.
Sambechua, good morning. Nananiha Sammy Matsaw. My name is Sammy Matsaw. Just to introduce you in my father's tongue, the Shoshone language. Just ask for a little bit of grace this morning as I share this with you through some humility about some of the disparities that come from the cultural differences between us as tribal people and you as primarily majority here as white settlers. And that I want to share with you the ideas. I think I have some slides that I'm going to share with you and a quote that we'll start this off with. So I'm a Shoshone Bannock ecologist. My title is a research scientist, but I'm also someone who thinks very deeply about these differences in our culture. I don't know if those slides are going to come up. But anyways, there is a quote that I'm going to share with you that's on the first slide. It says, human beings have a primary right to an intellectual life, but civilization has swept down upon groups of Indians and by destroying their relationships to nature, blighted or banished their intellectual life and left a group of people mentally confused. ... The Indians must have a thought world given back. Their intellectual world must have a direct relation to their world of responsible acts and spontaneous experiences. It's from Seneca author Arthur C. Parker back in 1960, around the turn of the century. In the figure that you're seeing above you, this is, as an indigenous ecologist, a representation of space and time. So there on the left is a map of data points of European contact with Shoshone and Bannock people prior to state lines. that are drawn there. So you can see that we had a vast acreage of land that was ceded through treaty signing, over 50 million acres to be exact. And all of that was for free. We didn't get any money for any of that. And what we're saying in this, as well as a connection to nature, so there's a difference between our connection to nature and your disconnection from nature. And I'll share a little bit more about that as we go on. And so there on the right is our seasonal round, so a Gregorian calendar laid over that with one of our language speakers who put this together about what foods we are interacting with across time. And this is just a snapshot. There's hundreds of food. They wouldn't fit all on that little figure, but it just gives you an idea where we would be at on the land, those places on the land at that time of the year. Next slide, please. So storytelling, some of our ancient stories that come from this land, and as I'm sitting next to the man over here at Yellowstone National Park, our origin story, so there's creation stories about the creation of Turtle Island. Those start with the beaver, the muskrat, and the otter. But this one in particular is a origin story for the Shoshone people, the Shoshone and the Bannock people. And in this story, I'll just briefly share this with you, is that there's an old lady, she tells Coyote to stay away from her basket of fish because he's going to spill them and they're going to go and fall in. She took a long time to catch all these fish. And the fish fall out, he tips their basket over, the fish fall out, they go down the Snake River. He makes these rock weirs, the water fills up, goes over the rock weir and creates these falls, Idaho Falls, American Falls, Twin Falls, and Shoshone Falls. Through that story, as we share that with our children, or as that was shared with me as a child, the old lady, and this lady in particular, she's Diane Yoop. She recently passed away, Diane Yoop. She was a woman who was a tribal interpreter on the Middle Fork, and we'll get to that story here in a little bit, the Middle Fork of the Salmon River. And but in her story sharing and in these different variations of the story, the old woman is Mother Earth, and the basket is the caldera of Yellowstone. And all the Yellowstone cutthroat trout, as they fell out of that basket, went into the Missouri River drainage and the Snake River drainage. And Coyote is phenomena. And so it's a metaphor of a story, an origin story that has very much intertwined with how we teach our children about science. And so in the next slide, you'll see through our nonprofit organization with my wife as a co-founder called River Newe, we take our tribal youth down the Middle Fork of the Salmon River where we've been excluded for the last century. And in those experiences, we're sharing with them their connections to that place. And we bring our elders along, we bring professionals along that are either tribal attorneys, tribal scientists, researchers. We also bring academic professors along, and they get to teach our kids and learn from them as well. And so what I'm saying in some of these cultural disparities, though, that we also want to have competency around is that we are speaking from a noun world. English is primarily made up of nouns, thousands of nouns, less than 1,000 verbs. And usually in indigenous languages, it's the opposite. And ecosystems are living in verbs. And so when we talk about our stories being interwoven into ecology and ecosystems, so are our stories. And so when we think and talk through a verb thought world, we have connections through what we would call our policies and our laws. And so when we have these conversations about funding and policy and collaboration, what is absent in that when we think through nouns is collaboration, because nouns set up your mind to think in opposites, and more importantly, to think in competition. Verbs steer you towards cooperation and collaboration. So when we talk about listening to the land, listening to the waterways, listening to the birds, listening to the plants and the animals, learning from them, you have to do that through a very cooperative way. But in the noun world, it's very hard to even see across skin color. And so that's the disparity. And so these policies that we live in today excluded indigenous peoples, the Shoshone Bannocks. The reason why River Newe exists is to provide a cost-free trip for our young people and their families who have not been back in those places for over 100 years. And furthermore, I would say this public-private partnership, it's good, but it's not all good. There are some bad parts to it. So our partnership with River Newe is another partnership with another nonprofit organization here in Idaho, which is now in Montana as well, the Red Side Foundation. And they provide mental health services for guides. And so some of the guides that go into the Middle Fork of the Salmon River fall in love with that place. So there's sort of these outliers, right? We're sort of talking more generally about like European teachings and even this ancient idea that we are not a primitive people. We took a different pathway in life on our knowledge system. And through that, what's happening is these people are coming into these places where we lived for very long periods of time, and they fall in love with it, these guides. And so they make an occupation out of it. But because of the industrialization of the Middle Fork, they're now coming away with mental health issues. And so the Red Side Foundation provides them mental health services. So that's why I say it's not all good. And our partnership with them is to bring them down, slow them down, provide them the ability to re-engage with the river through our lens. And in that, what happens is they'll be ready to go, raft loaded up, ready to go down the river. We're still getting ready. We're coming down. We're taking our time. We have a prayer. We have permission to get on their water again. And they'll stop and pull out their fly rods and do some fly fishing, which they never get to do. And they get to enjoy the time of slowing down on the river and falling in love again. And that's our perspective and what we're trying to provide, and that's a perspective that's recent, given that River Newe is really new, just started in 2019. So, yeah, I'd like to have some more conversation around that. I like what's happening today in this conversation, and the idea of recreating. I think starting over would be really a good place to go.
Okay, thank you, Sammy. Up next, someone who probably has a lot to say about collaboration is Leon Thomas, collaboration among other things. He's the district manager of the Phoenix district of the BLM in Arizona. When I say collaboration, I think there's a lot going on there. Managing public lands around probably one of the nation's biggest gateway communities, that is the nation's 5th largest city. So we will hear more from Mr. Thomas now.
Thank you. And thank you for your words. Very, very good work that you're doing there. Thank you so much. We can put the first slide up, please. You're going to notice I don't have a whole lot of words on my slides because I think the pictures say everything. So first off, I'm going to be telling a story, and it's a story about ownership, it's a story about buy-in, and it's a story about collaboration. So as you can see on this picture right here, we first had to own it, right? It started off with, me taking the staff out to one of these sites, which we have several in the Phoenix metropolitan area, and I had to ask them the question. I said, hey, what if this is our fault? What if this is about us, right? We want to say it's about the public land user, we want to say all these things, but sometimes the buck stops right here, right? And, it shocked them a little bit. They wanted to talk about how, we don't have the policy in place, and they wanted to talk about how, we need to, get some political buy-in on some of this stuff, which, was all true. But if we were going to wait for a top-down solution, it was never going to happen. And so we really wanted to start kind of from where we were at and work forward. And so that's pretty much what we did, So this area right here is what we call the church camp area. And like I said before, we have several areas that look just like this. And so we, in some of these areas, would have up to 3,000 visitors on a day and a weekend, vehicles rolling through. Because with Phoenix being a major metropolitan area with 4.5 million people, this is common. And guess what? The secret's out. People want to live in the West. And a lot of these communities that we're touting as saying, hey, there's 200,000 people, there's 300,000 people, and we're feeling pretty comfortable where we're at, one day you're going to have 4.5 million people in your backyard as well. So it's really good for us to start having these conversations, continue to have these conversations so that we can get out in front of some of this stuff. So that's what we attempted to do. I got a call one day, and it was from the mayor of Buckeye, which is a small town. Well, not actually, it's a growing community right outside of Phoenix. And he wanted to meet with me. I walked in the room, and to my surprise, we had special agents from Cox Communications and everything else in the room wanting to talk to me. And what they wanted to talk about was, at one of these popular target shooting areas, there was a fiber optic line that kept getting shot out. Every time the fiber optic line got shot out, Buckeye's 911 system would go down. Is that a public safety concern? So 2 months prior, that 911 system went down 6 times because of the activity that was going on at this recreational target shooting area, right? It was unmanaged. And so as the last panel was talking about, we have to think long and hard about how we manage for recreation in the urban interface. We can no longer just sit back and wait for something to happen. We have to be diligent about, thinking through some of the things that are possibly out in front of us as far as potential impacts, right? Mayor Duckett, Farmington mayor that was just up here, was talking a lot about how we get public users to be able to have access, right? When we're talking about mountain biking, when we're talking about film permits and everything else. So we spent a lot of time on my district thinking about, trying to be forward thinking anyway, about how we can go ahead and put the infrastructure in place, how we can go ahead and put the planning in place, so that when our constituents come to us, when the mayors of our towns come to us, we're not on our heels trying to figure it out. We've already thought about it a little bit. And I think that's what we're going to have to do in all of our communities. So with this right here, this was a real problem, as you can see in the picture. We had to figure it out. And so that was the ownership piece. The buy-in piece was, how do we get the buy-in, not only from the user group, but how do we get the buy-in from the community at large? How do we get buy-in from our chain of command up and down the chain? How do we get buy-in from the politicals? And so that was a work in progress. And I just want to say that we have some of those individuals in the room right now who helped to sell that buy-in or get us that buy-in. And one is Larry Rittenauer, who's sitting right in front here, who's at our headquarters office. We have Kevin Oliver, who's sitting right here, who's at our headquarters office. And we have Karen Keller, who's the state director now here at BLM, Idaho State, BLM Idaho, and she was our associate state director. And not only did she help catch some of those political arrows and help me navigate through some of the political nuances of trying to develop, recreational target shooting in the Phoenix district, she's an expert in planning, and she leaned in quite a bit and helped us with the planning effort. So to have someone in her seat and her level in the organization being willing to do something like that was tremendous. So it took all of us, rolling our sleeves up and thinking through how we can manage for this activity. So as it stands right now, the Phoenix District Office is the first district office in the Bureau of Land Management to actively manage for recreational target shooting. We can move to the next slide, please. This is the very same site that you just saw in the picture before. This is it. We now have 4 fully developed recreational target shooting sites on our district. Next slide, please. This is an aerial view. This is the church campsite. Very same space that we just saw in that first slide that was quite shocking to us. And so we had to figure it out. We had to figure out, what policy gaps did we have? We had to figure out, what resources did we need? What staffing shortages did we have? And then how are we going to manage and how are we going to enforce what we wanted to enforce out there? And when I'm talking enforce, I'm not talking just law enforcement. I'm talking about getting a community backing the ethic that we want to see on the landscape. The ethic as far as recreational target shooting in this case. And so it took a lot of collaboration. One of our primary partners through this effort was the Arizona Game and Fish Department. They had some corporate knowledge in place because they have a very large managed site that they use. And they leaned in and they helped us with our planning and how to, set up the berm structure so that it was legal. What are some of the things we have to do as far as a hazardous exclusion zone so that, we can look at the ballistic of the weapon and make sure that it's not flying into areas where people would be unsafe? How do we remediate for lead and the other contaminants associated with recreational target shooting? We had to think through all these, and the Arizona Game and Fish Department was instrumental in helping us to be able to think through this. So we feel like we have a pretty solid answer as far as this. It's really just now building the infrastructure, being forward thinking about looking at other areas on the Phoenix district that, may provide an opportunity for something like this, and then collaborating with others to be able to get us there. One thing that I really want to move to the forefront here is really that educational piece and that shooter's ethic piece. We had to think long and hard about how to really get to that. And there are several avenues for doing it. It's getting into our schools early and talking to the elementary kids about what we want to see on the landscape. It's public service announcements that we put in the movie theaters and on billboards and things of that nature and social media. So it's really about having a conversation continuously about the ethic that we want to see and ensuring that we are leaning in and not only talking through the ethic, but also listening and seeing what our user groups want to see as far as the ethic out there. So I'm going to pause here. I'm hoping that we get a lot of questions about the how, as we move through this. But that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Leon. It's interesting. 6-7 years ago, right after the first Bundy standoff on the Nevada ranch, I went out with a BLM law enforcement officer who had responded to the standoff in Nevada, in Southern District of Nevada. And I was asking him, like, show me some examples of the hostility you face and the anti-federal land sentiment. And to be a bit glib, he was basically just like, dude, the story out here is trash and illegal dumping and impacts of recreation. So it'd be interesting to get some more takes on that coming up. So up next, our last speaker, before we get into questions, is Toby Bloom from the U.S. Forest Service. She's National Program Manager of Tourism and Interpretive Services, and I think probably has a fair perspective on use of public lands.
I do, but really what I want to talk about is what a unique time period we're in right now and the opportunity that we all have as lovers of public lands to really kind of shape the future of recreation. I have some slides, if you could put those up, please. So I do work in big bad Washington, D.C., and I live there too, can you believe it? And I actually live 8 blocks from a national park unit called Rock Creek Park. That is my happy place. I go there almost every day. And so, even in Washington, D.C., even us hard-nosed folks, we love nature, and especially me. And so this first slide, it says tourism and recreation economies, big business, new business. Some of you may kind of be confused when I say new business, but what we have to understand is even though those of us in the room live and breathe recreation, this idea of recreation as an economic development tool is really new in the federal government, and we are building the plane while we're flying it. And so that's what I'm talking about, is all of these ideas are kind of new in the federal arena, unless you're just talking about our land management agencies, BLM, Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife, Park Service, and NOAA is now, getting into visitation as well. But now we are having attention and interest from other non-public land agencies, economic development agencies. And so that's what I wanted to talk with you all about today. Next slide, please. So this is a short timeline. When I talk about recreation as an economic development tool, maybe those of us in this room did not come to recreation as an economic development tool. That's not why I came to it. But when we start getting the money people to pay attention and to understand that it is big business, that's when we really start getting policy moving. And so I wanted to kind of give this timeline to show you that this is a new revelation. In 2017, there was a bill that was put forth called the Disposal of Excess Federal Lands Act. It was going to be 3 million acres that were going to be returned back to the states, presumably to sell off or to develop. And within 2 days, there was so much bipartisan blowback to the congressional representatives who proposed this bill that they pulled it in 2 days. That's really a big deal, that public sentiment was so strong for public lands that they pulled that bill. And if you Google it, you'll see a really nice photo of a congressman who proposed the bill in his camo with his dog and his gun, basically being like, I'm so sorry, I'll take it right away. I'll take it down. So that's what happened. And so in 2017, there was this recognition, this is not a partisan thing. Everybody loves their public lands. In 2018, Luis and Bob both talked about the Bureau of Economic Analysis and how we discovered just what an important economic tool recreation is. And I will say that the outdoor recreation satellite account, which is the account that measured the economic impact of recreation, was an idea from FICOR. And Luis mentioned FICOR as being this big multi-agency headless beast, which it is, but sometimes good things come out of headless beasts. And the ORSA was one of those. And so we finally realized, oh my goodness, recreation as an industry is just as important as telecommunications and pharmaceuticals in terms of percent contribution to the United States GDP. And so all of a sudden, these light bulbs started going on, and Congress people and the president and all of the secretaries of the non-land management agencies started paying attention. And that's when we started having these better conversations around, hey, we can use these as economic development tools. And at the same time, we were also seeing this trend that other panelists have mentioned where mines were closing. And not just mines, but a lot of the small towns across the United States were seeing employers that had been the main employer of their town for decades suddenly closing. Not just mines, we had universities closing, factories closing. Timber mills obviously was a huge one. And so people were really hungry for economic alternatives, and also the realization that we really do need to diversify our economies, and the environment does not have to suffer because of that. So it's not to say that recreation economies are a panacea, but it was a different way of looking at recreation that really has just started in the past 6 or 7 years. I think everybody knows about COVID and how basically America rediscovered its outdoors. Our numbers went up. We had, I think it was like 18 million more visitors in 2021 than we did in 2020 in the Forest Service. And our land managers in the Forest Service were like, what is going on? Every day is like the 4th of July now. And the communities were having, our gateway communities were having the same experience. There were, of course, some gateway communities that were used to receiving visitation, but all of a sudden, a lot of these small towns that were not prepared for it were getting huge visitation and people camping in their front yards, and they had never experienced it before. And so there was this recognition of tourism in the United States is not just about mass tourism. We really need to dig down and have tourism. The conversation about tourism has to include recreation economies, because when no international visitors were coming, that's who was visiting our public lands and our gateway communities. So we also saw a Great American Outdoors Act that Bob mentioned, and that was huge. That was funding of infrastructure maintenance for the land management agencies to improve our recreation infrastructure, that which had already been built, and also conceiving what it needed to look like in the future. That 5 years is coming to an end soon, and all of us in the land management agencies are really trying to strategize on how we get our politicians to renew the funding for that, and that's where your help comes in. Those of you who have, your voices matter. Me, one person sitting in Forest Service, I can't knock on somebody's door and ask them to do that. But if everybody in this room and everybody who's watching online goes to your politicians and says, hey, I just went to one of those new campgrounds and it looks fantastic, I want more of that. And so we're giving an opportunity. It's an easy bill to easy. It's already in place. We know how it works. And so if we can renew it, we can continue to work on our infrastructure. And also the permanent funding of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Yes, that has been in place, I think, since the late 1960s, 1968 maybe. But it wasn't until it was made permanent and that the funding, the maximum amount of funding every year, which started in 2020, that's $900 million a year of not your money. This is all money that comes from oil and gas royalties. So that is another way for us to fund recreation. And it has been in place for years, but we haven't been using it. And so this recognition that, we are going to make sure that $900 million a year and not a penny less is being spent on the Land and Water Conservation Fund, that's new. That's really new. And so the rules around Land and Water Conservation Fund, people are starting to understand it. They're starting to get better educated about their the statewide outdoor recreation plans that the LWCF is funded through. And so all of this is new. Most people didn't realize that the Land and Water Conservation Fund funds projects like baseball fields. It's not just national parks, okay? And every county in the United States gets funds from Land and Water Conservation, gets funds from the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So sort of bringing these ideas out, the funding is there, the money is there, and I know that it's hard to get it, but when we all as a public are educated on where that money lives and how we can get our hands on it, we're much more powerful as a community in how we fund recreation, and also voting and talking to your politicians. 2021, somebody mentioned ARPA. That is the American Rescue Plan Act. A quarter of that money, $750 billion, went for tourism and outdoor recreation. That has never happened before. And when the Economic Development Administration was put in charge of dispersing those funds, guess how many people they had on their staff that were recreation experts? That's right, this many, 0. They had never dispersed money for tourism and recreation. And so those of us in the land management agencies started to figure out that we needed to know the people at EDA, and we developed this relationship. And now there's ongoing conversations between all of the land management agencies and EDA. And even though those ARPA funds are gone, EDA has realized the importance of funding these kinds of projects. And so this whole new door was opened just in 2021. So the organization, the agency in the United States whose job it is to create economic development, just figured this out in 2021. So we really are at the beginning of these conversations. In 2022, the updated National Travel and Tourism Strategy. If you take a moment to look at that strategy, it takes more than a moment to read it. You know, it's a government document. But you will see the fingerprints of land managers all over this document. The first National Travel and Tourism Strategy came out in like 2008, okay? The first one ever. We never had a National Travel and Tourism Strategy, which is amazing. All of tourism was done at the state level. And so the 2008 tourism strategy was basically an answer to 9/11 and the US losing a huge share of international visitors. And so when you look at the 2008 strategy, it's about how many international visitors, how many dollars are we getting? When you look at the 2022 strategy, a lot of that is kind of a response to what happened during COVID. And so the strategy is much more about how do we equitably disperse tourism marketing dollars and make it tourism managing dollars? How do we get communities to have access to capacity building with grant writing and tourism management? And when I say tourism, I'm also talking about the recreation economy. But you know, these are really new concepts. And I think, like I said, it's lost on a lot of us who have been doing this work our whole lives. And so I just want you to understand we're in a very special time and we need to strike while the iron is hot. Next slide. So here are some of the, oh, you know what else I forgot to mention? In 2022, FICOR was reestablished, that group that came up with the outdoor recreation satellite account and was also responsible for upgrading recreation.gov. How many people in this room have ever reserved a campsite or other asset on recreation.gov? That's right, you couldn't do that before. You could do it, but it was really difficult and not every place was on there. And so FICOR, even though it's a headless beast, it's a benevolent headless beast that's trying to do good things. So we just got reestablished again this past summer, and we're working on that and trying to do things like bring in the Department of Transportation so that we have transportation to public lands. The low-hanging fruit that we're working on right now is getting our websites, recreation websites, translated into the most common spoken languages. So there is work going on. It's difficult when there are different agencies that have different objectives, but we're doing the work. And again, you know, FICOR is not new, but the way we're looking at it is new. And the agencies that are being brought in, like Department of Transportation, Bureau of Indian Affairs, they were not in the last iteration. So things are changing and getting better. And these are some of the outcomes of these changes, are programs that are actually funding recreation economy and tourism. We just re-signed our new MOU within USDA. Forest Service is part of Department of Agriculture. And we're working with USDA Rural Development and NIFA. Rural Development is basically a big loan bank. NIFA does community planning, and so we're getting the expertise from those different places to do recreation economy planning in our gateway communities. Rec Economies for Rural Communities is run by EPA. Forest Service also contributes to that, and that is a series of workshops for communities that are looking to develop a recreation economy plan. There's no funding involved, but the planning has really helped a lot of these communities go on to receive bigger grants to do their programs. Native Act, which was established in 2016. Native stands for Native American Tourism Improving Visitor Experience. BIA was the first agency to get that money. Forest Service started getting funds in FY21. We got $1 million in FY21. In FY22, it was 1.01 million, and this year, FY23, it's 2 million. And so we're seeing the importance of working with our tribal partners and working with our communities and getting better representation and telling our stories. And then I mentioned the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So these are new, and there are new opportunities out there, and there's new money. And so I wanted to get that out there today and make sure that everybody realizes that you need to strike while the iron is hot. Let's all work as a community to continue this trend of increased funding and increased attention at the federal level about recreation infrastructure. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Toby Bloom. So we have a lot of data to download there, and I'm sure you all have questions. There's note cards on your table. You can write them, and someone will come around and pick them up, I believe. To get things going, as a reporter, we always have questions, sometimes nagging, so here we go. Sammy Matsaw talked about the historical inequities in Indian country and Native people not having a seat at the table historically for decisions that were made on their ancestral lands. I think there is some movement. We're in a bit of a reckoning right now. There may be debate about whether or not it's a reckoning, but there is some movement in the other direction, which is encouraging. But I'd be curious to hear from the National Park Service and federal land agencies and managers about what they're actually doing right now on the ground to address these disparities and better collaborate. And maybe when we get back to Sammy, Mr. Matsaw, you can give us a few examples of some positive movement in that direction. So you want to start with Superintendent Sholly.
So first of all, I mentioned the 150th last year. We really looked at that not only as a commemoration of Yellowstone as a park, which is very important, but also as a point in time to really re-engage our tribal partners. And to really, there's 27 affiliated tribes with Yellowstone National Park. So tribes that either were in the park before its creation or around it, or to one degree or another find the Yellowstone ecosystem culturally, historically meaningful to their tribes. We set off on a very aggressive tribal consultation, tribal engagement process in the year leading into the 150th. What came out of that, I think, was some pretty incredible ideas, some of which we implemented last year. Sammy and I were, I guess, just about a year ago at the Wind River Reservation, which hosted a symposium that was multi-tribal federal agencies talking about this exact topic. We launched the first ever Tribal Heritage Center in Yellowstone National Park, where we had 30 different tribal members, scholars, artists at Old Faithful in their own center, directly engaging visitors, contacted over 10,000 visitors in a single year. The Park Service has a big part of its mission, which is to tell America's history, the good and the bad, but no one can tell the stories of the tribes like the tribes can. So that was incredibly important. We set up a significant number of tribal internships in our wildlife programs. 13 tribes participated in something that we called Yellowstone Revealed, which was a tribal teepee encampment that we put in at Madison last year, which was incredible, another opportunity for tribes to engage the public directly. And many of those ideas are going to carry forward into the future. We put $1 million into expanding our bison conservation transfer program, which takes live bison, puts them through a 2-year protocol. Once they're certified as brucellosis free, they get transferred to the Assiniboine and Sioux at Fort Peck. Over 200 bison have been transferred to 23 tribes in 12 states, including Alaska and New York. The tribes literally FedExed 3 bison to Alaska last year. And it's pretty amazing to see these bison get loaded. Steve Bullock was a big part of the state partnership that initiated that program. But to see 3 bison get loaded on a truck in special containers, driven to SeaTac in Seattle, loaded on a FedEx cargo plane, flown to Juneau, unloaded onto a barge, and then taken to an island, and the gate drops on the barge, and these bison are like, where the hell are we? But so we've got some very meaningful partnerships. We have a long way to go. Like I said, we used last year as kind of one of the main points in time to do a better job in this critical area.
It's a really complicated subject because we're not just talking about, the disparities right now. We're talking about the disparities that have existed over this nation's history, right? And so it's really about, economics. It's about race relations. It's about everything. And so if you touch on the economics piece alone, you're never going to close the economic gap until you close the education gap. And there are many pieces to that as well. And so on our district, we try to really focus on how we can close some of that education gap through, getting out on the landscape and having, the public schools out there with us and teaching the children early about the importance of the public lands. It's about ensuring that we have internship opportunities on our district and hiring, a diverse workforce so that when we do have people out there working on the landscape, they're speaking the same languages, they're understanding the backgrounds of the recreators that they're out there interfacing with, and they're having a true understanding of what, the barriers are that are keeping people from being able to recreate on our public lands. And so it's a really complicated question. It has many tentacles to it. Without getting real political sitting up here, which I can do, I really just want to say it's really just about leaning in and focusing. And then also making sure you have a diverse workforce and staff that's willing to be out there on the landscape and educate. Just on the Phoenix district alone, sitting in the middle of the Phoenix metropolitan area, I was shocked that I only had 2 people on our district that could speak Spanish. Right? And so now everyone on the district has access to Rosetta Stone licenses. Right? We're making sure that we're hiring people that can speak Spanish. And that has nothing to do with skin color. You don't have to have brown skin to speak Spanish. And it was interesting to see the pushback that I had initially when we talked about, wanting to hire people to speak Spanish. They thought I was talking about skin color, and I said, I don't know where you got that from. Right? And so it's a really complicated question, and I think that we really need to focus on how we're really going to address it at many levels. When it comes to tribal consultation, I think if you start there, you've lost. You don't understand the essence of what we're trying to do. It's really more about tribal coordination and inviting them to the process early, so that when we are working on, whatever we're working on, they're there at the table early and they're providing their input. And they're kicking the dirt with us early in the project and helping us build it from the ground up, whatever that may be. I think that, until we change our mindset and change the paradigm in this country as a whole, we're going to continue to ask these questions for decades.
Thank you. And Toby, you talked about hundreds of millions of dollars coming into tourism and recreation. Could you talk about some of that made its way to tribes?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that part of it is relatively new for the federal government as well. Traditionally, it's only been Bureau of Indian Affairs that has funded real, tribal development. And it wasn't until Ed Hall was in BIA and he worked in tourism. He and the American Indian Alaska Native Tourism Association were the real proponents, and Senator Schatz from Hawaii were the ones who got that bill passed for the Native Act. And that was back in 2016. And the bill got passed, and then there was no funding given. And so again, tribes spoke up, and there were some tribal representatives that had a little bit more of a voice in Congress, and they said, look, we passed this bill, we need to fund it. And so they gave some money to BIA for a few years. But our argument was, look, Forest Service lands are tribal lands. Everything that we manage is tribal land, and we need to be telling those stories. The people are out there, the stories are out there. We need the people who are coming to visit to understand that, and we need the people who work there to understand that. And the projects have been helpful in trying to reestablish relationships, reestablish communication, and it also provides a better opportunity for somebody who's visiting. Interpretation is the other side of what I do. And so I do tourism visitation and I do storytelling. And I feel like every agency should have those two together, even though it's two jobs. But telling the story is really a part of how we all become better working together on these lands. I will say Forest Service is also in the process right now of reestablishing a new recreation strategy. We had a conversation with several tribes at the end of March, and the realization is that our tribal partners feel that recreation is one of the main threats to tribal lands. And so this is part of the dynamic tension of what we are trying to reconcile between the very high demand from the public and the very real issues of respecting the lands of the people who, are from the places that we're managing. And so there is dynamic tension. There are no easy answers. It's very much about having conversations. In the Washington office, I think the way that we can address this is, structurally. And so we, after establishing, when we got the Native Act funds for FY22, we developed a partnership where we passed almost all of those funds in FY22 to the American Indian Alaska Native Tourism Association, which is IANTA. I'm just going to call it IANTA because it's long. And they helped us make sure that it was a more equitable, open process. We also, after we established that agreement, were able to get our general counsel to recommend to the chief of the Forest Service, and it is now interim policy, that there are no matching requirements. When we have a partnership with a tribe or another underserved community, the local unit, you don't have to go up to the Washington office, the local unit has the authority to waive the matching requirement. And that's a policy that's been in place for decades. And we always talked about, why is this? I have $2 million. There's no tribal organization out there that can give me a match for that. And so we were able to get it waived. And it wasn't easy, but once we did it, it was kind of like, why didn't we do this before? And so there is a lot of this new process going on. We also have a program in place in the Forest Service called the Resource Assistance Program. And that is a paid internship for young people. They have to have a college degree, and they come into the Forest Service for either 6 months or a year. Sometimes they can get extended, and it's a paid internship. And all of our partner organizations for implementing that, the Forest Service pays for half of their salary, and then our partner NGOs pay for the other half of the salary. And so we have some tribal colleges that are partners. Hispanic Access Foundation is a partner. We have several other organizations whose goal it is to get underserved communities and less represented people on public lands back into those public lands. And so structurally, that's how we're trying to address it. We also have a new tribal equity action plan, but it's brand new. And so we'll see what that looks like with implementation.
Okay, and Sammy, I wonder if you might have some wrap-up thoughts on this. And in the interest, we have a lot of questions up here, so maybe in the interest of doing double duty here, we had a question that came in that I think you could also address maybe in responding. Can you discuss the role of federal tribal collaborations, whether that looks like actual representation and interpretation, co-management, or even the return of these public lands to tribes for tribal management? The Bears Ears National Monument comes up a lot in this discussion.
Yeah, I think the returning of land is very important. That's a very serious conversation about how to deal with any sort of discomfort that white settlers have. Those are meaningful ways to actually address the issues that are going on as land back. We don't have any blue squares. You look at any federal lands and there's these blue squares that got given to the states and no consideration for the tribes. I think the other part about this other thing that's going on in this disparity is, well, first of all, How many people understand that we live in two different worlds, a verb world and a noun thought world? Was that news to you? See lots of nodding heads. So even in that translation, there's some of our ideas and thoughts that don't even translate to English. And so you can see a lot of the frustration when we're trying to collaborate. And so we have these conversations about what we're being excluded from. So earlier it was mentioned that there's an excise tax, there's excise taxes. There's more than one policy, and the tribes are not included in either one of those. There are legislation furthermore that goes into the pockets and the coffers of the states, but the tribes are never considered. So over and over and over, even before all of this opportunity was before us, the tribes were never considered. And so that is also a part of the treaty right. So we retained a right on the land, not just on our own lands, but across all public lands, unoccupied. And those are plants, animals, water, but those permits are being sold to out-of-state hunters at a profit. We don't get any access to that. We don't get any permit sales, period. And so we do get some on reservation, but off reservation, zero. So this is an ongoing story about how we are, I mean, it's reflective. There's deficit statistics with the tribes. Those aren't happening by accident, just like it was written in the early European contact that this was the Garden of Eden. It wasn't Garden of Eden on accident. All of this richness that comes from this land was on purpose. It was by design. We are ecological geniuses, if you will. And so in that conversation about what we're talking about today and recreating these relationships, it's really acknowledging the idea that we have different knowledge systems. And so when we talk about co-management, the co-production of knowledge, we don't have academic institutions building our nations. Our nations are crumbling down around us. Casino systems aren't really working that great, and they're finite. It's going to end here soon. And so for us, the future doesn't look so bright. Although there are some opportunities that are being presented through the federal system, but it still has to do with interpreting bureaucracies, and each agency has their own bureaucracy process. And so even someone like myself with a PhD, as Dr. Matsaw, has a hard time interpreting the bureaucracy sometimes. And going from agency to agency, there's differences. The other part of that is once you get a proposal or an RFP, there's universalisms in them. So on the other end of that, when you apply a universalism or you're talking to our community about universalizing information or knowledge, that disengages our tribal communities. Because universalizing things is actually delocalizing knowledge. We are not in the business of delocalizing knowledge. And so when you offer these grant monies through universal processes, or you want universal information from us, it's a disengagement. As an example, there's other nuances beyond these, but, and I'm not saying one extreme over the other, I'm just saying there should be some balance. It's not a world of opposites, there's continuums. This is a big struggle in the idea of the knowledge system of Western Europeans, and that struggle for us in living in it is very real. And so I think I hit on most of them. Did I leave anything out?
No, all succinct. Thank you. We had a number of questions directed at Leon, but I think these are questions that most on the panel, if not all, could address. Talking about moving past the why not mentality within federal agencies. When we talk about impacts on public lands from shooting ranges to illegal dumping, one person in the audience here, I'm mashing these up because we won't have enough time, mentioned that here in Idaho there's a very similar issue at the Snake River Birds of Prey National Conservation Area, which is just to the southwest of Boise. But there are countless examples of this. So how can the culture and mentality of pushing through the why nots somehow, as you've done in the Phoenix District Office, be institutionalized within federal land management agencies? You have 30 seconds to answer this question. Because I think, people, it's a common refrain, right? People out on the land say, well, my local BLM district ranger gets it. But when it gets up to DC, it gets tied up in bureaucracy and nothing gets done.
Well, I think the beauty in what we were able to create stems from the fact that we worked with our headquarters office and we worked with the department in formulating what we needed to do to move forward. And so I think a lot of that knowledge has been institutionalized. In addition to that, our district is offering up to other BLM offices and Forest Service offices, if they're interested. We're going to be doing workshops so that we can, have people come to the workshops and we can show them, how we did our planning, how we're managing them now, and some things that we think that we need to think through moving forward. And so I think just the sharing of knowledge and the educational piece is key.
Does anyone else want to take a stab at that? How do we institutionalize?
Well, I think the flood last year in Yellowstone was a really good example. The Secretary Holland, Chuck Sams, you'll hear from Tracy Stone Manning. For us to do our jobs at the field level, it really does require support, and it requires us to follow the law, but also at the same time be efficient. You look at what we did in record time in Yellowstone last year as far as getting the park reopened. That was not just a Yellowstone thing. It took a lot of collaboration with communities, counties, states. Most importantly, though, the Department of Interior, the Federal Highways Administration, and so many others. And so what I really like about this point in time right now is we have leaders that get it and are very, very supportive of finding the best solutions, doing it right, but if it's possible to do it quicker and better and say yes, not no, that's where we want to be.
And Superintendent Sholly, we may as well keep, since you have the microphone there and it's hot. We did have a question looking at funding for flooding, and I think that this relates to some of the tensions we're getting at here about not being able to get things done or not having enough discretion at the local level. So the question is, how is it that the National Park Service has spent hundreds of millions of dollars fixing roads after the recent flooding in Yellowstone? I gather a decision that came from the National Park Service in Washington, but the questioner says they've not made investments in reservation systems, expanding camping, or alternative access to Yellowstone to diversify use and access while proactively managing crowds or vehicles. This sort of gets to the very easy job Superintendent Sholly has.
Raise your hand who asked that question. No. So I can't do that in 30 seconds. It's a long conversation. There's a lot of different ideas, as I said in my opening comments, about how we should be doing things, what we should be doing, what's the right type of access and recreational opportunities in Yellowstone versus a national forest versus a BLM district. I would suggest that, as I mentioned, there's no question that we have significant issues with increasing visitation, trying to balance the protection of the resources in the park while providing for their enjoyment is the ultimate challenge. I think that, just so you know, our visitor use strategy is really focused on, number one, what are the impacts of increasing visitation on resources in the park? What are the impacts on staffing, operations, and infrastructure? That's a really big one. What are the impacts on visitor experience? And what are the impacts on gateway communities from an economic and recreational access standpoint? And trying to bring all of those together as visitation increases and protect that place for the future while still providing a wide range of appropriate recreational opportunities is really the challenge of the future for us.
Yeah, I also think a big part of it is really educating Americans that there's more out there than just national parks. And I think, this is something I've been proposing for years, is that we have a marketing agency for America's public lands and waters. Because guess what? There are 5 national forests right outside of Yellowstone, and you can camp there. And there are camping sites available 6 months out. If you go to recreation.gov, you can see all of the campsites that are available within 10 miles of Yellowstone. And so you can go to Yellowstone during the day and then camp in a national forest at night. That's not to say that there are always campsites available at all of the national forests, but I'm saying that the average American knows national parks and they probably don't know national forests. Out west, you all are more familiar with your national forests, but again, it's about telling the story and making sure people know the options that are available to them. And when we have conferences about, like inbound travelers from other countries, there are more than just 4 national parks. There's a million out there. My favorite, and there's not a million, I know there's like 100 some odd, but my favorite national park is Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota, because it gives you that national park experience. There's wild stallions, there's prairie dogs, there's bison, there's badlands. It's where Teddy Roosevelt went after his I think his wife and his daughter died on the same day or something really tragic like that. And so there's history and culture there. The community is beautiful, and they get very little visitation because nobody talks about that. And so it really, I think that we, FICOR and all of these other agencies, if we can work together to promote the other assets that are out there, and that includes gateway communities, we'll be in a much better place, and we might be able to reduce a little bit of the tension in these really high visited iconic national parks.
So we also have a question here. We've been talking about a lot of money coming in to manage outdoor recreation, the outdoor recreation boom on public lands. Maybe we'll go to Leon here. Where is conservation in all of this? The focus is consistently on increasing access and economic opportunities, but without proactive, comprehensive plans to protect natural lands and cultural resources, are we not putting them conservation at jeopardy? I'm paraphrasing a bit here. I guess my question might be, how do you balance that? And do you have time if you're just having to deal with the impacts right now? How do you get proactive about conservation in this recreation boom that we're experiencing? Outdoor recreation.
I'm going to tackle this question from just a couple of angles real quick. So the first angle is not actively managing for recreation has an impact on conservation, right? So being proactive about the way we're thinking, being proactive about the way we look at our landscape, and making sure that we're looking at it through that lens. Then on the other side of it, through our resource management plans and through our planning processes, we're making sure that we're being diligent about making sure that we're focusing on, the conservation areas and the ACECs and making sure that those are protected. We're also making sure that we're staffed up enough so that we can do the proper monitoring out on the landscape to ensure that these resources are protected as well.
One thing I'm going to point out, the National Park Service, the centennial was in 2016. In 2013, we launched a massive marketing campaign called the Find Your Park campaign, where we marketed U.S. national parks globally. We told the entire world, find your park. Guess what? They did. The National Park System visitation went up from 280 million a year to 330 million in 5 years. The vast majority of that 50 million increase was absorbed by about 35 parks, and arguably many parks that were already at or close to capacity. If you want to have, back on the earlier question, a really fun conversation, start talking about visitation caps and reservation systems in Yellowstone. That is a very, very difficult conversation to have, especially when so much of the economies of the 3 states that Yellowstone sits in depend on tourism. A lot of work to do there. We will get to a point where that's going to be required. We're not there yet, but it's something that we've got to get to together. It can't be just a surprise, hey, we're going to put a reservation system in the park next year. It's got to be collaborative and solution-oriented.
Okay, we just have a couple minutes left before the break, so I want to give all of the panelists here an opportunity to wrap things up. I was just looking at the former governor's quote here on the pamphlet, "Is the West in danger of being loved to death?" said in 1998. I guess I'd ask each of you, we've been talking a lot about opportunities and also a lot of impacts, and many of them negative, about what's happening. What gives you hope? I mean, we're in this situation where we've had an explosion of use and outdoor recreation, which is good. More people means more understanding, more conservation, but there's also a downside to that, particularly if we don't have the resources to manage this explosion.
Well, I'll just say that the health of the Yellowstone ecosystem is better now than it was 150 years ago. That's a fact. When you look at the health of the ecosystem overall, we can be very proud of where we've come over a long period of time. It's up to us to make sure the next 150 years is even better. I think that it's really important for us to separate fact from fiction when it comes to use or overuse of our public lands. When you look at pictures of traffic jams at grizzly bear sightings in Yellowstone, and that's put out in the press as that's how it is everywhere. 70% of visitors that come to Yellowstone are first-time visitors. They've never seen a bison in the wild. They've never seen an elk. They've never seen grizzlies. It's not their fault the Park Service didn't build shoulders on the sides of the road so they could pull their cars over. The people that are mad about traffic jams are the locals, the employees, and the repeat visitors. The 70% that are there as a bucket list trip that are seeing that bison for the first time, that's why they came. And it's really important for us to understand that most of Yellowstone doesn't even see a visitor. So let's focus on the real issues. Let's make sure we're separating fact from fiction. Let's celebrate some of the successes that we've had collectively as a society. And then let's really work together to put aside differences to move forward in a positive way.
There's a balance I've heard before about, you don't protect what you don't see. So if people aren't out there looking at it, why would they protect it? And given what I just shared, we're in a process of extraction that's been going on continually. Extraction from indigenous knowledge, from indigenous lands, whether it's for gas and oil or for mining. Those pathways were there. They were our pathways, and they're the pathways we learned from the animals. Those weren't there because of those industries. They were already there. And same for the highways and the towns. Any town that's along a waterway, including this one, which I has heard is called Boise, and you guys are all saying it wrong, is that we were there. We were here in these places. And being here in these places and where we are now in time, I would say that it's really hopeful that we can have conversations. If we're going to talk about protecting land, we're talking about protecting the intellectual space and places of indigenous peoples. And in doing so, a lot of the land was industrialized. I would say if I've shared anything with you, you should understand as well that that was a lobotomizing of our peoples by converting that land into what it is now. And it's been a really sad state of affairs for us. And going forward, what is hopeful is that we can talk about policy and funding and collaboration in the hopes that we will look at a better future together as neighbors and as people who call this place home. And last but not least, I'll say Usundaga, thank you. To the audience, to the organizers, and to my co-panelists and our moderator, thank you for having me today. It's an honor to be here.
So quickly, what gives me hope is the fact that we're having this discussion, and at a national level, I know that we're working on a recreation strategy that is going to reach across, not only the different BLM offices, but hopefully also reach across, the federal lines when it talking to the Park Service, the Forest Service and everything else. And so it's common knowledge. People don't know sometimes whether they're standing on the green part, yellow part, purple part, or blue part of the map. And so really just building that synergy is going to be really important. Another thing that gives me hope is just seeing, some of the success we had out there with the recreational target shooting sites. Just within 2 months of being open, we had 16,000 vehicles show up to just that one site right there. And we have 4 others that we have on the district. And not only are we getting the use, but we're also getting respectful use. We're getting responsible use. People are out there cleaning up after themselves. We have numerous volunteers that are raising their hands to help us out on the sites. And so I think that people are really excited about the possibilities out there when we all collaborate.
Yeah, I feel very similar. I do want to point out there was he recently retired. Steve McCool was a professor at the University of Montana who did some excellent work on recreation. And what he discovered is that with visitation, it's usually like the first 10% of visitors that cause the most impact. And then the level of impact really kind of levels out. And so thinking that more visitors means more impact is not always true. So let's make sure we're doing our research. Like Cam is saying, let's make sure that we know what is an actual fact. And for me, it's not about the number of visitors. It's about making sure that our visitors are coming to the land as land stewards. And that's our job, is to make sure that we're creating land stewards. We're giving everyone an opportunity to connect with nature. That, of course, you're always going to have folks that are going to get their social media picture and post it, and that's the end of it. But as land stewards, our job is really to help people connect with nature and understand the larger importance of nature to us as human beings and as a society. And so when we can address that and make sure that our visitors have the same ethic that we have, I think that will help a lot of our issues. But that's what gives me hope, is kind of this mainstreaming of people coming to nature for so many different reasons. And I think the better that we can be at creating land stewards rather than people who are just snapping a photo for Instagram, the better off our land management will be, because it's not just, the one person who has 15,000 visitors to manage whose job it is. It's all of our job.
Okay, thanks everybody.
It is now time for lunch. You'll find lunch where you got breakfast, just down the hall.